All right, well, we are in the last and final week of our series called Happily, which I have thoroughly enjoyed, and so many of you have been really generous by sharing your thoughts. Quite honestly, what's been fun for me is the greatest feedback or the greatest thank you, I guess, in this series has actually come from people who aren't married. And so that's been really fun and exciting for me to hear, but excited by the ways that God's been working through the life of our church in this series. Now, if you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, I'll just kind of catch you up real quick on what we've been saying, at the heart of this series. We said at the beginning of the series, we said, hey, part of the reason we're talking about this is because so many of us grew up with this idea, this notion, this belief that was given to us that marriage ought to be the greatest source of happiness in your life. Marriage will be the place where you're ultimately fulfilled, where you feel complete. In fact, we were told, hey, you're like one puzzle piece that's cut a certain way, and out there is some other puzzle piece that's cut a certain perfect way for you, and you couldn't be happy if you don't find that other puzzle piece, and so you need to find that puzzle piece, and when you do, everything's just gonna be great, right? Many of us were told that. We believed that. We stepped into that. But for those of us who have stepped into marriage, or for many of us who have just observed even the marriages of others in our lives, we've seen that, as much as marriage ought to be a great place for happiness, and sometimes it is, it also in many ways becomes one of the greatest sources and places of heartache and heartbreak in our lives. And we've said through this series that part of the reason for that, right? Part of the reason is we step into marriage with really high expectations for our marriage, things that we hope for, things that we dream for, things that we even expect to be a certain way. And then when many of us step into marriage, we've seen this in others, right? They step into marriage, and pretty quickly they begin to experience the realities of marriage. And that reality doesn't quite live up to their expectations. And in the gap between those two, they experience things like heartache, disappointment, frustration, pain, hurt. Right? And then we have to figure out how to deal with that stuff. We have to figure out how to process that. We have to figure out how to work through that. And many times, in fact, I would say our natural response in these kind of situations, right? We actually respond by looking at a reality and going, man, I just need to change my reality, right? I need to do anything I can to change my reality. If I could just get him to start talking this way, if I could just get her to understand this thing, if I could just get him to stop, if I could just get her to start in this way, right? My reality would shift and come back in line with my expectations. And we've said this, you can spend your whole life trying to change your reality, and you might still live with that gap. So in this series, we said, hey, maybe we need to move back a little bit and stop focusing so much on our reality and start looking back at our expectation. Say, hey, do we actually have the right expectation for our marriage? And I've told you this from week one. I've told you this every week. Our expectation for marriage ought to be high. It ought to be high, but it might need to be different. And that's the shift that we've been talking about through this series. Now, today I want to talk specifically about an expectation that a lot of people, in fact, I would say most of us have walked into marriage with, will walk into marriage with, or have watched other people walk into marriage with. The expectation is this, that our greatest differences will complete one another. You hear phrases all the time like, he completes me, she completes me, right? Some of you have lived enough to know what actually happens on the other side of that statement, right? We hear this all the time, right? This idea that, hey, you're like made a certain way and someone else is made a certain way and you two are made perfectly for each other. And when you find each other, you will find full completion within each other. Now, part of this expectation is built on this concept that we talk about all the time, which isn't necessarily untrue. This idea that opposites attract. Opposites attract. How many of you right now, if you're married or dating, in a serious relationship, you would say, hey, I am partnered with or married to or in a serious relationship with someone who is in many ways opposite of me. Let me see your hands real quick. Very much opposite of me. I see some of you staring at each other, giving them the side eye. I might have seen a couple elbows there in the process, right? I'm married to someone who's very opposite to me, right? But this idea that, hey, the reason that you ended up together is because of how different that you are. We see this reflected in culture all the time. In fact, the couples that we celebrate, the couples we love watching, right? The couples whose stories we follow, even like stories on TV, what have you, that we follow, like reflect this idea that opposites attract. In fact, where are my Office fans in the room? Where are my Office fans at? Right? Like Jim and Pam, a theme of the whole show, right? In many ways, are opposites, right? Jim is off constantly creating havoc or messing with people, right? Having fun, willing to speak his mind, right? Pam is a little bit more reserved, a little more calm. For some reason, attracted to Roy for a season or two, which none of us quite understand, but thankfully Jim broke her out of that, right? But in many ways, opposites, and it's the fact that they were opposites that bring them together that actually is part of what we love about them. Also, one of my friends' fans at Chandler and Monica, right? Chandler and Monica, big couple and friends. In fact, this is amazing to me, right? If you can check this out, you can read about this, you can watch about this. it was later in the season, in the show, right? A later season when Monica and Chandler actually went from being friends to being in a romantic relationship. And when they were doing the live studio recording, remember they used to record, forget pre-laugh tracks. They recorded these things live in a room with a live audience. Hard to imagine, right? When they were filming that episode where Monica and where Chandler get together and begin to date, right? The moment that happened and was announced, the studio erupted in applause for minutes, to the point that they had to stop the taping of the show because the people there live in the audience, fans of the show, were so excited to watch two people who are very different from one another, right? Very, like constantly goofing, constantly bringing attention to himself, constantly drawing a line and saying, hey, it's this way, it's not that way, it's black, it's white, right? Two people completely opposite of each other, getting together and beginning a relationship in that moment, set the studio into like applause that caused them to force them to stop the taping, right? We love the idea that opposites attract. Any Parks and Rec fans in the room? Leslie Knope, Ben Wyatt, get together, right? Like Ben Wyatt, super accountant, right? Like very factual. Ben Wyatt is like my spirit animal, you know? Leslie Knope, on the other hand, shooting from the hip, like constantly just like new idea. And Ben's like, we can't afford it, right? That hits home closer than I meant for it too, right? You know? But again, two people, not anything like each other, and yet it's their opposites that actually bring them together. And it's the thing about them that we've loved. And part of the reason we love that is because you and I have experienced this personally or witnessed it personally, right? So often the extrovert ends up with the introvert, right? The saver ends up with the spender. Where are my savers at, by the way? Just want to give a shout out to my savers. Good work, right? I'm with you, right? The planner ends up with the spontaneous person, the socialite, with the person who just loves being at home. The debater ends up with the peacemaker, right? And it's the things that are different about one another that actually begin to draw us to each other. But eventually, you spend enough time with someone who is different from you. And we begin to discover other things that are different about that person, and maybe even deeper things that are different about that person that actually don't attract you, but actually begin to repel you from the other person in different ways, right? You find yourself going like, hey, whoa, like I thought it was the things about you that were different that I actually like, but then those begin the things that actually drive against you, and those begin the wall, and to be the wall and the barrier in your relationship, right? In fact, the other way I would say that is, right, what's supposed to complete actually begins to compete in the relationship. The things that were designed to complete or that you thought would complete you actually begin to be the things that compete between you or create competition between you and the other person and create that sense of, hey, like we just can't figure quite this out. And the more I thought about this, the more I processed my own life, there's really three types of differences, I would say, in just about every relationship. If you were to drill this down, if you were to distill this, if you were going to like break this down in the core, any type of difference that you find between two people can almost always fall into one of these three categories. The first one's preferences, things that I like, things that you like, right? He likes Chinese food, she likes Mexican. He likes hiking, she likes the beach, right? He likes getting out and being with friends, she likes staying at home with a good book, right? Preferences, things that you like and things that he likes, things that she likes, right? Those are differences that you have. The second type of difference is the difference of personalities, right? Things that, like, not what you like, but actually how you're like, right? The things about you that you are wired for, right? The things about you that are a little bit different, right? The things about you that kind of begin to manifest themselves, right? Like he's fast-paced, she's slow-paced, right? He makes quick decisions, she makes slow decisions, right? He's outgoing and extroverted, life of the party, draws attention to himself. She's a little bit quieter and softer and doesn't want the spotlight on her at all, right? Personalities, right? Now here's the thing with these, right? Like you can discover preferences and personalities pretty quickly about each other, right? In fact, a dating profile online will tell you most of what you could discover, at least a lot, a starting point about what you discover about someone's preferences, what they enjoy, what they like, and about their personality, right? How they kind of are like, how they tick, what drives them a little bit. Right? But there's a third area of difference that shows up in time eventually. But it takes time to show up, and that's the difference in priorities. Priorities, the things that actually drive you and move you to make decisions and to do things and to spend your life in certain ways, right? The things that are most important to you. Right? Now, here's the thing about this, it's interesting. You can have the same preferences and the same personalities as somebody else, but those preferences and personalities can be driven by very different priorities without you even realizing it. I'll give you a simple example. Emily and I both love Chick-fil-A. In fact, when we were dating, our favorite date spot was Chick-fil-A. I would be driving to a nice restaurant. I would dress up. It would be good. I would check my checking account balance to make sure I had enough money compared to the menu, right? To make sure I could afford the restaurant before I took her there. We'd be on the way to the restaurant, and she would say something along the lines of, I really just want Chick-fil-A. I canceled reservations at times at the last minute and derailed, took the exit, and we went to Chick-fil-A, right? Now, we both enjoyed Chick-fil-A. We both loved it, right? But we loved it for two different reasons. For Emily, it was, hey, it's familiar. I can get a salad. I know I like it. It feels healthy, but I love the taste of it as well. For me, it was, I just saved like $70. You know what I mean? We had the same preference in that moment. But the priorities that drove our preference in that moment were massively, massively different. This is why two people can look perfect for each other on the outside and then end up in a mess down the road. This is why you've looked at people, or you've watched people and go, man, they're perfect for each other. They both love to hike. They both love to, read. They both love to whatever. They both are funny, outgoing. They're perfect for each other. And they jump into a relationship, and in time, they fight like cats and dogs because their preferences are the same. Their personalities are very similar, but the reason for their preferences, the reason for the way that they're wired and the way that they operate come from two very different places of priorities. Right? And when you hit that place, that's the place that's actually really hard to work past. It's the hardest one to see and understand about somebody else. And it's also the hardest difference to work through. In other words, I'd say this, or another thing to note about this, right, is our priorities are actually driven by our deepest values, by the things that we actually care about, the deep-seated convictions that you and I have about how the world should operate and how you and I ought to operate within the world. Our priorities are driven by our deepest values. Right? And our deepest values come from somewhere. But often we don't even realize quite where those values come from. For many of us, our values come from our parents, right? Things that our parents poured into us or didn't pour into us, our experience with them drives how we view the world and feel convicted about how we ought to operate within the world and how the world ought to operate towards us, right? Childhood, for many of us, formed and shaped the different experiences that we had uniquely in our childhood, right? Formed and shaped the way and the things that we valued and the ways we felt like the world ought to operate, the ways that we ought to operate in the world, life experiences that you've had along the way, things that have happened to you, things that should have never happened to you, form and shape the values that you have about how the world ought to work, the people and moments that shape you, right? Those are the things that actually begin to form your values. But so often, we don't even realize where those values stem from. And we don't even realize where those priorities flow from. Right? So how do we figure out what our values actually are? How do we figure out what we actually truly care about? And here's what I found to be true in my life. I bet it's true in yours, right? That our deepest values are revealed in our biggest moments of decision. Our deepest values are revealed in our biggest moments of decision. Because you know this is true. It's one thing to say that you care about something. It's one thing to say that something is important to you, and it's a completely different thing to live it out in a moment where it feels like something is on the line, right? This is why many of us get frustrated with corporations or companies in our lives, right? Companies that say, hey, we value our people, we value our team. And then when push comes to shove, they lay people off 2 weeks before Christmas, right, to get the books back in line before the end of the fiscal year. And all of a sudden, in a moment of big decision, their deepest seated values are revealed. This is why many of us get frustrated with politicians or leaders in every area of life, right? Because they often say one thing is important to them, but then in a moment of decision, actually choose to do something else. Our deepest values are revealed in our biggest moments of decision. Decisions like our finances, right? What to do with our money. Decisions like our parenting, how to raise our kids. Decisions like time, how to actually spend the finite pieces of time that we have. Decisions like our relationships, who to actually pour into. You know why I believe money is the top reason or top source, an area of conflict in the life of a marriage? Because when you take two people with two different sets of priorities and give them one set of shared finite resources to spend, you quickly discover where their priorities are, and you quickly discover where their priorities differ. When you're arguing about money, you're not arguing about money. You're arguing about what's most important to you. You're arguing about values. So in all of these areas, in marriage, in business, right, in different areas, every area of life where we have a close relationship, right, so the values that drive you either unite or divide you. The values that drive you either unite you or divide you. Many of you have experienced this in marriage. This is true in business partnerships. Many of you jumped into a business with a friend, right, or a family member or somebody close to you, and you say, hey, we're going to start this thing together. We're going to build this thing together. And you got into it, and then a few years into it, you realized you both wanted to start the same business and the same organization and do the same thing, but you realized you actually were wanting to do it for two different reasons. And then in moments of big decisions in the life of that business, or that organization, or that project, or that initiative, right, each of your deepest values actually were exposed. Some of you have jumped into marriage and discovered, hey, you know what, we both said we love these things, but then you got into it and you realized, hey, we've got big decisions to make, and those big decisions exposed your values, and those values actually began to divide you in the relationship. Your deepest values either unite you or divide you. Which leads us to the question that we're diving into today, which is simply this: when values collide, who wins? When values in our relationship collide, who wins in that moment? Now, the past couple of weeks of this series, we've been working through some texts and some letters by the Apostle Paul, which is one of the earliest leaders in the life of the Christian church. And he would write letters to churches to encourage them in different ways and different things, and instruct them about things that they were dealing with in that time and in their location and in their space. In the last couple of weeks, we've read a couple of portions of the letters where Paul spoke and wrote specifically to people on the topic of marriage. And we've dove into those, a couple of those. Today we're going to dive into a letter that actually has a line within the letter that I would say, if you grew up in church, if you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard this line of that section of that letter before. And anytime you've heard it, I'd be willing to bet, because this was true of me. Anytime you heard it read in the context of marriage. And this one line was placed as a rule and a principle, and in the context specifically for a marriage relationship. What we're going to find this morning is that line actually wasn't written specifically to married couples about marriage. It actually was written in the context of a greater passage that talks about, just as important, but another deep relationship. And it doesn't just apply to marriage, but I would say it does apply to marriage. It also just applies broader than that. And you've probably only heard it from one angle and one side and with a single perspective. And today I'm going to encourage us in this. It applies there, but it also applies to so much more than just there. Okay? All right, so let's dive into it. Paul writes this to the church in Corinth. He says, "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open." Now let me give you a little context here before I go on here. Paul has just told them about some of the difficulties and the hardships that he has been experiencing and the people with him have been experiencing because of their love for Jesus and the ways that they're advancing the mission of Jesus in the world. They're going around, they're teaching about Jesus, they're advancing this new way of living, really this new value system within the world. And they've experienced hardship, difficulty, imprisonment, challenge, right? Abuse. And he's just told them about this, right? And said, hey, these are all the things that we're enduring for the sake of advancing these things that we care deeply about. He says, we've spoken freely to you, Corinthians, our heart is wide open towards you. He says, you are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children, widen your hearts also. So he's writing to them, he's just told them about the ways that they're advancing this new way of living in the world. He say, hey, we have deep love and affection for you, but your affection is restrained towards us. Your affection is held back from us to a point. Many of us have been in situations, I bet this is true of you, haven't you been in a spot where you found yourself deeply loving someone, deeply loving someone, but at the same time finding that they don't fully love you in the same way and to the same degree and with the same strength that you are loving them? It feels like their love is actually held back by something. Probably been times in your life too where you just felt someone deeply loving and pouring affection on you, but there was something that was keeping you from fully loving and fully giving your full affection to them. He says, hey, we're fully loving you, to this church in Corinth. He says, we're fully giving all of our affections to you, but your affections are restricted from us, so widen your hearts also. And then he begins to talk to them about the things that he believes are actually holding them back from fully loving him in their relationship. And he says this, and this is the line that most of us have only ever heard in the context of marriage. He says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Now, it's an interesting statement right there. And again, many of us have heard it, but only heard it out of context. He talks about being unequally yoked, which is a weird thing to say. And you're like, all of a sudden we're making eggs, and I don't really know what's going on here in this moment, right? This idea of unequally yoked, it comes from this ancient Hebrew law that basically said, hey, don't take two animals that aren't the same and harness them together to pull something heavy. Right? In other words, don't take an ox, obviously really strong, right? Partner it with a donkey who's not as strong, put them on the same harness, and ask them to do work together or pull something very hard or heavy together. Because in doing so, naturally, one of them is going to be pulling harder and with greater strength than the other one of them. Right? And one of them is going to get worn out. And there's going to be frustration between the relationship of these two animals. Now, if you're married, isn't it true that there have been times where one of you, right, you or your spouse, felt far more strongly about something, far more convicted about something, far more passionate about something than the other one of you? And that one was pushing harder and harder and harder for something than you. And that actually put a strain on the relationship just because one person was pulling with a greater level of strength than the other and caring more deeply about something than the other one of you cared about it. Paul said, hey, be careful not to be unequally yoked. Be careful not to harness yourself or partner up with someone who doesn't pull with the same level of strength that you pull with, doesn't have the same level of deep-seated convictions or the same passions or deep-seated convictions that you have, because at some point, that's actually going to put a strain on your relationship. And then he goes to illustrate this and demonstrate this and kind of drive his point home with a series of 5 questions that he just throws at them, right? He says, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial, which is just an ancient word that means worthlessness? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? And he's using these questions really just to draw a dichotomy and to draw 2 extremes in the ways that people can view the world. So, hey, when 2 people, when you partner up, when you allow people in your life who and link deeply with them, connect deeply with them, right, who share different convictions or see the world in a different way or live with a different set of deep-seated values, you actually put yourself in a situation where agreement never really fully becomes possible, right? Where partnership isn't actually fully possible, where harmony actually isn't fully possible. He goes on to say, for we are the temple of the living God. In other words, hey, we in our unity actually are the place where God himself begins to reside and dwell, and where we experience the greatest harmony and unity with him. It's actually our unity that creates space for that unity with him as well. And then he goes on and he paraphrases a little bit. He paraphrases some text, a few different texts that he kind of puts together to paraphrase some texts from the Old Testament. Basically talk about God's commitment and covenant to his people, and basically calls people to live in a certain way, not because they need to live in a certain way to deserve God's love, but basically God's covenant saying, hey, I have covenanted with you, and I'm committed to you, and as I'm committed to you, right, seek to love me and live in certain ways as well. And then he wraps up that section with a statement that's a little bit interesting. It takes a little bit of work to kind of muddy through. I almost left it off, quite honestly, because it takes a little bit of work to work through, and because it actually has some language and some verbiage that many of us kind of get repelled by a little bit. I thought, you know what? I think you guys can handle it. I think you guys are up for it. Here's what he says. Here's how he wraps up the section. He says, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. Now, I grew up in an environment that when people use the word holiness, there were a whole lot of things attached to it. Holiness meant that you shouldn't play cards because people might think you're gambling. Holiness meant you shouldn't go to movie theaters. I'm really not sure why they told people not to go to movie theaters, quite honestly. I'm like, but it's rated G. It's fine, right? But like, they had like these sets of rules and restrictions that they told people to live by, and they kind of labeled it all with holiness. And so I'll just tell you, when I see that word, I'm instantly repelled by it. which is probably why I almost just left it out of today. But what Paul's talking about here, what he's saying here, is basically this. He said, hey, there's actually a way that you and I were created to live in alignment with the values of the God who created us. And there's a divine set of values in the world that we're actually called to lean into and partner with. And when we do, we actually experience the full benefits of living in the ways that we were created and made to live. And Paul's looking at these people saying, hey, these things and these people who have actually started to pull your heart and pull the things that you care about and pull your values in different directions. He goes, hey, start to move back and live back in the ways that you were designed and created. And then he bookends this section with this, which is the same way that he started this section. He says, make room in your hearts for us. In other words, as you continue to move back into the values that you were created to hold, and as you move back into living in the way that you were designed to live, and as you move back into deeply caring about the things that you were designed to deeply care about, you actually will begin to make room back in your hearts for us to experience the fullness of your affection as well. And Paul, in his relationship with his people of this church, would then begin to become unified once again. They would find themselves once again back on the same page. And they would find themselves once again connected to one another fully because they shared the things they cared most deeply about, because they shared the same values, the same worldviews, the same hearts, the same convictions, the same things that were most important and prioritized to them. Now, the way I'd say this, right, as we talk about this, the way I'd say, if we're going to take all this section, right, the way I'd sum this up, and the way I'd say this to you, whether you're married or you find yourself in a partnership with a business person, or you find yourself starting something new and linking arms with someone to do something significant, the way I'd say it is simply this, right? That unity between you actually comes through values beyond you. Unity between you comes through a set of values beyond you. It actually comes from beginning to lay down the things that we naturally prioritize and the things that we naturally care about. And to begin together to go, hey, we're going to pick up the same set of values. We're going to pick up the same things that we choose to make important to us. But we're not going to choose those things ourselves. We're not going to sit down and go, what do you think is important? What do I think is important? What do you think is most valuable? What do I think is most valuable? We're actually going to look to a source beyond us to provide a set of values that we can connect to and live out. And when we do connect to those values, those are the values that will actually begin to unite us. It's a laying down of the things that we might naturally care about and a mutual commitment to actually move forward towards the same things and caring about the same things, but letting something beyond you define what those things are. I've said this for about 2,000 years. People have found those things in pursuing the way of Jesus. They've found those values in asking, what does the way of Jesus actually call of me in this moment? Regardless of what I feel like is most important, regardless of what feels most valuable to me right now, what does the way of Jesus lead me to in this moment? When you begin to lead that way in your relationships, in your marriage, in your deepest of partnerships, you actually begin to shift the question away from which of us is right in this moment to what does the way of Jesus look like in this moment? If you're married, this is a question that shows up all the time, all the time, all the time. In finances, right? Where one of you values one thing naturally, and the other thing longs for and desires another thing. One of you wants to spend it on experiences. The other one of you wants to spend it on stuff. One of you wants to get great things for the kids. The other one of you are like, the kids have enough. We're buying a boat, you know? You find that you're spotting yourself in the spot all the time, right? What Paul invites us to is to go hey, it's not what do I want, what does he want, what does she want? Tell you, what does the way of Jesus look like in this moment? I heard a story recently, I've heard stories like this over and over and over again, where a couple was hanging out with some friends, and they realized as they were hanging out with some friends that those friends actually had a financial need in their life. And they just they recognized it, they observed it, and they got in the car and they were driving home. And one of them looked at the other one of them and said, hey, you know that money that we have set aside for X, Y, and Z? I think we should give it to them to meet the need that we know that they have. And the other one of them looked across at the first one of them and said, I was thinking the same thing. That kind of unity doesn't come from, hey, what do I want most in this moment? Or what's most important to me in this moment? No. That kind of unity comes from two people who are passionately pursuing the ways of Jesus and saying, hey, what does the way of Jesus tell us is most valuable in the area of our finances in this moment? I've seen it over and over and over again in the lives of couples. It'll show up in parenting, right? If you're mutually parenting together, right? I remember when Addie was our 5-year-old now, she's probably 3.5, 4 years old. We signed her up for soccer, mostly because I felt like soccer was the safest sport for a child who had no athletic genes to do, right? Like, we know she can run, she's proven that. All we got to do is kick, right? That's all we got to do. So we signed her up for soccer. And I'll tell you, I spent the first season of her playing soccer frustrated because the only thing she didn't do all season was play soccer. She would run around. She would talk to friends. There was one practice, like it was so bad one practice, I took her to the car and I said, hey, do you remember when you didn't do this, didn't do this, didn't do this, didn't do this? Cool. Well, your team practiced for an hour and you didn't. So this week we have an hour of practice time to make up between now and the game on Saturday. We had make-up practice in our backyard, right, because of it. And Emily would look at me and she'd be like, hey, why is it so important to you that she actually practices? Like she's having fun. She's 4. It's fine. Why is that so important to you? And I realized the more I talked about it, the more I thought about it, I realized I want my kid to start now because I don't want her to get behind. And I want her to be good at something athletic, quite honestly, because I wasn't good at anything athletic. And for years of my life, that was a point of insecurity for me. And that was a thing that I actually was frustrated by, bothered by, and didn't like about myself. And I was trying to protect her from some of the pain and some of the insecurity that I had experienced in my life. And so in that moment, for me, what was most important for my daughter was that my daughter would be athletic enough to avoid shame and disappointment in life. And I wasn't actually valuing the things that her Heavenly Father cared about for her in that moment. I was valuing the things that I had naturally picked up along the way. This will show up in your parenting. It'll show up in time. The ways that the two of you choose to spend time with one another, it'll be there, right? The ways that you choose to spend your time away from each other, the ways that you choose what to do with your time, right? It'll show up there. It'll show up in relationships, right? Who do we choose to pour our lives into in this moment? Emily and I run into this often, right? Because her values, quite honestly, are just better than mine, right? But so that, hey, we need to hang out with so-and-so. And I'll go, I don't really enjoy hanging out with so-and-so. You know? Don't act like you don't have that list. She goes, no. She'll go, hey, no, like, I think we need to pour into them right now. And I go, yeah, you're right. That's what the way of Jesus would call us to in this moment. And there's nothing about me naturally that wants to lean into that relationship. And there's nothing about her naturally that wants to lean into that relationship. But together we go, hey, no, we're not committed to our individual values. We've chosen to say, hey, the way of Jesus, that's what's most important in our life. And we together are choosing to align ourselves around those values because unity between us comes through values that come from beyond us, and together choosing to lay aside the things that we feel are most important and together move towards a different set of values that come from a deeper place. So, if you find yourself this morning in any sort of conflict or tension or difficulty with the person you're married to, the person you do life with, or the person who you're partnered with for something significant, be that work, be that business, be that an organization, be that an endeavor, an initiative that you care about. And you find yourself constantly head to head in a certain area. Here are the 3 questions that I would be asking if I were you, because these are the 3 questions that I have to ask myself. The first one is this: where do we consistently compete? Where do we together consistently compete with one another? Second is this: what are we each prioritizing in that moment? If we get to the bottom of it, if we really process it out, what is most important to each of us in that moment? And thirdly, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, what does the way of Jesus call us to value in this area of our life? Where do we consistently compete? What are we each prioritizing? And what does the way of Jesus call us to value? No. I told you today we get to celebrate with Anna, who's taken the step of baptism in her life. And let me say this, Anna's taking this step for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that Anna's actually saying in this step that I think is important for us to acknowledge as we celebrate. She's actually saying, hey, there are natural things that I value in life and natural things that are important to me and natural priorities that I have. She's saying, I've made a decision to let those things go and start giving those things up and setting those things down for the sake of picking up a different set of values that she would tell you she's found to be more trustworthy, that she's found to be more difference-making, that she's found to be more reliable, and that she's found hold her consistently, even in seasons where life feels massively inconsistent. So before we celebrate Anna's baptism, I want you to have the opportunity to hear Anna's story in her own words. So let's take a few minutes and watch this together.
So my senior year, I started dating my boyfriend Braden, and that's when I started going to church more often. I noticed that Braden's family and a lot of the community at church were very welcoming to me. I just felt like a lot of people were just excited that I was here. My sophomore year at the U was pretty tough for me. I had some anxiety problems for a couple months, but it got pretty bad when I started going to school again. It was a lot of chest pains, spiraling, a lot of thinking, overthinking about things. A lot of things were becoming different for me than I wasn't used to. I wasn't used to doing this bad on tests. And my freshman year was a shock on its own already, but then this fall, sophomore year, withdrawing from class, literally getting 11% on exams that I would try and study for when everybody else was getting a 75. It was just really, really hard for me. I don't know, I guess just didn't really understand what was going on, because it's not like I wasn't trying, and it's not like I wasn't trying. And it was just a lot of overwhelmedness and a lot of stress. There was a lot of things going on that I was really stressed about, school. My relationship was not going well because I was stressed all the time, and just lots of things going on. And I wanted close friends that I felt like I could trust, because it's kind of something I had been not really having as much. And yeah, it was just a lot to carry, it felt like. I would go to this one group called SALT, and I would go and I got involved with a C group, and I started to feel like some of those people were genuine friends, and that helped a lot for me to help feel less alone. And it was just a good time to really just talk about the past message and how it applied in our lives. I had way more of a connection to it, because I don't know if it was I was putting more of an effort towards listening to the messages and talking about it after, and forming relationships with these people who some of them ended up being really good friends of mine. And I think that really made a difference in my faith journey at that time, and eventually it helped me lead me out of where I was feeling. I really started to feel closer to Jesus when I started praying more and just opening up, because it felt a little bit like there was weight off of my shoulders about a couple things. Just thinking back about the things that I was struggling with, and I prayed about and prayed for, they were delivered, and just in their own time. And there was a reason for what I went through, whether it had been anxiety or not being able to or forcing myself to eat. All of those things were just, it's they were a part of that journey. I just didn't realize it at the time. I have a little bit more peace in myself, in my life, knowing that there is a plan whether or not I see it. It's kind of just affected like my outlook on a lot of things and being more positive, which is something that I used to really struggle with. If there's anybody struggling with anxiety, I would just say it does get better if you seek help and if you pray about it and you have to fully give it up, not half give it up to God. That was also something that was a little bit of a struggle. And it's not like my anxiety just disappeared, because I feel like that's a misconception that people have. It doesn't fully go away, but it becomes easier if you just really are intentional about giving it up fully and knowing that there are things that are out of your control and that some of the things that you're worried about that have happened might be for like a reason, and things coming up can be good, you know? I decided to be baptized because I wanted to make sure that I was like baptized in a church that I felt like was my home, and I wanted to be fully confident that this is what I wanted to do and this is what I believed. And yeah, I think, I reached that point. So I would like to just like thank everybody here who made an impact on me at this church. Just being like welcomed from the beginning, how I've felt in this community and feeling like special and appreciated, and this community has really helped me on this journey and on this decision to get baptized.
Listen, if you serve in any capacity, if you give in any capacity, if you invite in any capacity, this is why we do what we do. Because we never know, you never know what someone's carrying. You never know what they need in that moment. But when you show up in their life again and again and again, you create space for God to step in ways that only He can, but He chooses to use you. As Anna said, I just want to say thank you for that. We're going to celebrate Anna's baptism in the lobby in just a second. Before we do that, let me pray for us. And then what you can do is you can just walk out the doors and turn to the right, and you'll see us there. We'll be there for just a few minutes. Let me pray. God, I thank you for Anna. I thank you for her courage and intentionality in sharing her story with us. God, I thank you for the ways that you have been working in her life, the ways that you have led her into a relationship with you through Jesus. God, for anyone in the room right now who finds himself carrying some of the things that Anna described, God, would you also show them the peace and the comfort that comes through a relationship with you, through knowing your Son, and through caring about and valuing the things that you lead and create us to care about and value. God, we just look forward to seeing you at work continually in the life of Anna and the life of all of us. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.